Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third of our panel discussions in the Oxford Minds lecture series. My name is Dr. Susan James-Relly. I'm the Associate Head for Education in the Social Sciences Division. Delighted to have you here this evening for our panel on justice. We have had amazing lectures on race, sustainability and justice so far, and this is our third panel discussion with an amazing panel. Thank you, for joining in. I know that some of you are dotting in and out, and some of you have attended all 6 of our events so far. Alex Betts, who is the Associate Head for Graduate and Research Training, and I developed this series because of the pandemic. Oxford has a lot to offer, but wasn't always going to be easily accessible during the pandemic. So we wanted to offer you a lecture series that brings together Oxford's minds, its great minds, but also on topics that Oxford Minds is mindful of. And that's how we've developed this series. So it's an absolute joy to have you here. Really looking forward to hearing this panel. I'm going to hand over to Alex to introduce it and we can get started. Please do put questions in the Q&A and we will publish them and we'll have a chance to answer them in our session at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks everyone for joining us. In last week's lecture, Baroness Helena Kennedy QC talked about what justice means for her based on her career in the law and her experience of challenging politics through her work in the House of Lords to rethink justice at all levels of society. This week, we're going to delve even more deeply, I think, into the concept of justice and what it means from different disciplinary perspectives across the social sciences division. And we're going to begin with a perspective that comes from political theory, with Professor Zofia Stemplowska, who's Associate Professor of Political Theory and Asa Briggs Fellow at Worcester College. And Zofia focuses on work that really asks what we owe one another from the perspective of justice, but also works a lot on ideal and non-ideal theory. And amongst her many works, she's co-editor of a book on responsibility and distributive justice. We'll then move to something grounded and practical in the context of criminology and socio-legal studies. Dr. Shona Minson has kindly stepped in at the very last minute. And I'm really thrilled that you're able to do this because Shona is a BA postdoc at the Centre for Criminology and quite recently finished her DPhil in Oxford and has already been able to publish that book. Forthcoming, I think next month, is her book, Maternal Sentencing and the Rights of the Child. And it reflects her long-standing work on the rights of children whose parents are in conflict with the law, and particularly incarcerated mothers and the way in which they relate to their roles and the impact on the child. And I think one of the things that is really salient about Shona's background is she won a very prestigious ESRC Celebrating Impact Award for the impact that her research has had on the probation service, on the judiciary, on magistrates, in really challenging the way in which maternity, motherhood, and the rights of the child are considered before the law. And then finally, we'll be joined at around 5:30 by Professor Jonathan Wolff, who is Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and a Fellow of Wolfson College. And Jonathan connects the worlds of political theory and public policy, working on applying political theory and theories of justice to a range of very important practical themes, from gambling to recreational drugs, to disability, to equality and disadvantage. So I think we're in for a real treat of 3 very coherent speakers who will each give us a perspective based on their work before we open up to hopefully a very interactive question and answer session. So Zofia, delighted to hand over to you. You just need to unmute.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be bundled in the same subject area, justice, as Helena Kennedy, who gave the lecture last week. I met her as a high school student, and I've been a big fan of this great feminist voice ever since. But my brief for today was to tell you how I think about the concept of justice in relation relation to my own work, including non-ideal theory, and its application to normative debates relating to contemporary global issues. Now, doing non-ideal theory sounds pretty relaxing. Everything I do is pretty non-ideal, but there is also a technical distinction here between ideal theory and non-ideal theory that matters to justice. So ideal theory asks us what is required for us at the bar of justice when everyone else is doing what's required of them, whereas non-ideal theory tells us what's required of us when there is non-compliance. And clearly the two sets of requirements may be very different. Take COVID restrictions. If we could assume full compliance, we could have very fine-grained rules that allowed households to mix, for example, even after lockdown, if they already mixed through schools. But we cannot assume full compliance. And so we get rules that reflect this, are easier to enforce, but also more restrictive. Now, I assume it's pretty obvious to you why we need a non-ideal theory given non-compliance. The world is very unjust, and so we need to know what to do in light of this fact. Maybe even this is the main thing we need to know, and some argue it may be the only thing we need to know. We can dispose with ideal theory altogether. That is, we don't need to ask the question of what would be required if everyone complied with the requirements of justice. There is this controversy out there. So let me introduce the controversy with a concrete example. In the world, there are more refugees and forced migrants than countries are willing to admit. Although some countries, especially near the zones of conflict, end up accommodating quite a few of refugees in any case. Does justice require every country to do its fair share of admitting or assisting? Undoubtedly. In fact, even if we assumed full compliance, there would still be people suffering from natural disasters that can create refugees, and the international community would have to step in to help. And such contributions of the international community would have to be divided fairly. But of course, we don't have full compliance. There is war, there's persecution, there's unwillingness to do one's fair share or even anything at all. There are also duties of mitigation of injustice that fall on some countries more than on others due to the history of colonial exploits, lethal exploits, other past things done that created poverty, disastrous climate change, that rightly affect what would count as a fair share to be done by any given state. So we have a concrete question, which is this. Does justice at the non-ideal level, in non-ideal theory, require countries to do more than their fair share if other countries aren't doing enough, that is, given non-compliance? And my answer is that it does, although there are people who argue otherwise. So some say, if you have done your fair share, then it's unfair to require you to do more. Or they say, if you do more, you incentivize others to do less. Or they say, if you do more, you treat others as if they weren't moral agents capable of stepping up. But I think that even if all these things were true, we would still have a duty of justice to do more than our fair share, if we could do so at a reasonable cost to us, and if others were in dire need. Now, admittedly, in my work, I postulate duties quite liberally. I think we have duties such as duties to the dead to mitigate historic injustice, duties to support equality across the world, duties to support state schools, etc. But the duty I'm invoking here is actually pretty conservative. It's just duty to absorb reasonable costs in order to help those in dire need. Now, you will have spotted that I said that there was a duty of justice here, without telling you anything at all about what I meant by that. And after all, I was meant to tell you what I thought justice was. I guess the honest answer is that I am not sure how to define justice. But the good news is that perhaps it's really a secondary question, Perhaps all we need to know is what people are required to do, and what people are required to do that is enforceable. That is when they have no complaint against proportionate coercion. That is, we need to know when duties are enforceable in this sense. And whether we then call them duties of justice or something else is less important. Although in fact, a lot of paper has been wasted, in my view, on quite unproductive debates about the nomenclature here, when we should be getting on instead with identifying enforceable requirements. There is a further question of whether we can ever know if we are required to do anything. And that's a great debate in its own right. For a quick answer, I just challenge you to imagine a situation in which, say, that's just an appeal to your intuition, your neighbor performs some truly horrific act, but you genuinely still think that perhaps it is fine for him to do so because he has his own fully equivalent conception of justice to work with, and there is no common standard out there after all. Now, there are people who think that, but they're wrong. So go back then to my claim that countries have a duty to do more than their fair share of aiding refugees if other countries aren't doing enough. You may think, if the duties I have in mind are enforceable, then do I really want to say that people have an enforceable duty to do more than their fair share? Yes, that's what I want to say. But if they're enforceable, won't it follow that those who don't do their fair share will have the right to enforce the duty? And isn't that a weird result? Weird, even though this is precisely what we are witnessing around the world. Affluent countries limit ways of access to their own borders and force other countries to do more than their fair share of admitting forced migrants. So do I say this? Can non-compliance force others to do more than their fair share? Yes and no. No, they don't have the right in the sense of how rights are understood. In enforcing compliance without complying themselves, they will be violating their own duty. That is, they face a choice by assumption here, comply or enforce someone else doing more than their fair share. And morality is pretty clear here, as is justice. It says comply, choose compliance. That's your duty. But yes, I do want to say that enforcement is permissible. The country whose compliance is being enforced has no complaint insofar it does indeed have a duty under the circumstances it finds itself to do more than its fair share. It can point out that it ought to be compensated for the fact that it finds itself in such circumstances, but it cannot complain that under these circumstances it is forced to do its duty. You may find this plausible or not. Either way, I hope the discussion illustrates that a lot of non-ideal theory is done when we already presuppose that we know the answer at the ideal theory level of what is someone's fair share of compliance. And therefore, ideal theory can guide answers in non-ideal theory, determining when compensation, for example, might be required. But ultimately, of course, if you were to remember just one thing from this talk, I don't want it to be about what is ideal theory or non-ideal theory or the relationship between them, but just that we all have duties to do more than our fair share of eliminating dire need.
Zofia, thank you very much for doing more than your fair share in this conversation and for this series. That gets us off to a great start. And Shona, let's come to you.
Thank you. So I just want to begin by going back to something Helena Kennedy said last week in her lecture. She said, justice is about fairness and respect. It is not on the margins. It's at the heart of everything we do. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. When I was starting out as a barrister, which is what I did before I moved into academia, I was introduced to a much more senior barrister who, through a friend, and I went to see him in his chambers to talk about sort of some of my queries about whether this was really a profession I wanted to go into, because I was honestly clueless. And I ask the perennial really stupid question to ask a barrister, which is, you've probably guessed already, how do you represent somebody that you know is guilty? Now, the reason that is a not great question, I'll give you the answer so you never have to ask it of anyone, is that if you know someone is guilty and it's a criminal case and they've told you that, but they want you to argue that they are not, you are professionally embarrassed and you withdraw from the case. So that is never going to happen. But your job is actually to represent a person, let them tell their story and let other people make the judgments. You, as a lawyer, you're not there to make the judgments, it's for other people. Now, this senior barrister was very kind. He didn't roll his eyes at me. He gave me that answer. But he then said, Shona, this is a flawed system. You need to understand you're coming into a flawed system. We do our best. You are not going to find justice. I find that quite deflating, but actually they were really wise words. So nearly 3 decades on from asking that question, having worked both as a lawyer and a criminologist looking at the criminal justice system, I am very well aware of just how flawed criminal justice system and our understandings and expectations of it are. I've also got a much broader conception of justice than that which I had as a 22-year-old. My own work, and I'll just touch on it very, very briefly, has extended really who we think is affected by criminal justice. I've spent 8 years now looking at the experiences of children whose parents go to prison. And the reason was that when a child is separated by the state from their parent in family proceedings, so in care proceedings where there's been abuse or harm or neglect, the state steps in, protects the child. There is actually a statute called the Children Act, which says the best interest of the child are the paramount consideration of the court. Everything that's done is about looking at that child's best interests. You then step across to the criminal courts, separate a child from their parent because the parent has been convicted of a criminal offence and they're going to go to prison. And nobody was even asking if there were children, let alone worrying about what was in that child's best interests or what was going to happen to them during the parent's imprisonment. So there was a fundamental level of injustice existing, affecting quite a big group of children in our society, approximately 300,000 per year. And that's the work I've done, and I was very kind in the introduction that it has had some impact on policy, and the book, in fact, was last December. Thankfully, I'm not trying to finish the book for this December. But that's what I've been working on, really, is trying to understand more broadly what is justice within criminal justice. 10 minutes isn't long to talk about this, so I just want to pull out a few points which might lead on to discussion. And forgive me for focusing on criminal justice. I think I am the grounded bit in the middle of more sort of intellectual discussions around this. So I will focus on criminal justice. You can't have criminal justice without social justice. Helena said this last week. She talked about courts needing to understand what was happening outside the court door. And at this time, we have 2 fundamental problems, I believe, in seeing justice in society here in the UK. Firstly, as was picked up in last week's lecture, there is a lack of respect for the rule of law. Now, when Parliament was prorogued around this time last year, I saw and felt it as a paradigm shift in the future of the country. Now, perhaps that seems overdramatic, and it did to some people I discussed it with then, but to me it signalled a government, or at least Prime Minister, who didn't really believe in the rule of law. And once that has been overridden, it's difficult to know what is left to challenge injustice or wrongful use of power. And the anti-lawyer rhetoric and failure by the country's most senior law officials in government, the Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General, to object to breaking of international treaties, amongst other matters, has sort of continued that drift over the past year and is quite concerning. I wonder where that's going to take us. Now, coupled with that, we've been experiencing a pandemic. And one of the effects of the pandemic across all sorts of issues has been to crystallize what's really going on. We've seen the truth, whether it is of relationships, can they survive lockdown, or bigger societal issues. And I think one of the things that has crystallized is that there is a lack of interest in social justice in the UK at the moment, at a government level, but also at a more general level. And we've become very much a society that others those who we punish. And this pandemic has, I find it quite distressing to see just how far that othering goes. So you may well, I've spotted at least one person from criminology in the audience here, and it's nice to see them. I don't know what you know about the system, so forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know. But since the 13th of March, when prisons were locked down, which was about 10 days before the rest of us, many prisoners, including children, have been kept in their cells, often in what amounts to solitary confinement, for up to 23 hours and 45 minutes each day. Now, according to international obligations on the use of solitary confinement, anything over 15 days of solitary confinement is known to have a detrimental effect on a person, and there are various safeguards put in place. But in our country, prisoners have now been experiencing this regime for 8 months. The restricted regime has meant that all visits have stopped. People can't go into the prisons. That means social visits, also legal visits, education programs, training, healthcare, progress through the system has all halted. Now, the reason for this, and again, Helena alluded to it last week, is that our prisons are too full. It's therefore not safe during pandemic to be able to staff the prison to a degree and have enough space for people to move around to do normal prison life. And so the only solution to keep people safe has been to lock them up. So at the beginning, they said, we're preventing a public health catastrophe. We're going to lock people up. Now, lots of other countries looked at the same situation and said, we are going to release people, reduce the numbers in our prisons, and therefore manage this system, this situation in a more humane way, but not here. So there was an early release scheme set up. The government said it would probably allow about 4,000 people out, which isn't huge out of a population of around 80,000. In fact, a couple of hundred were released. I was involved in trying to campaign for the release of pregnant women. And in fact, just today, we have resent a letter to the Lord Chancellor 8 months on, saying we know the risks of imprisonment to pregnant women at the best of times, and now is the time to let people go. So I just want to really ground this as to how this has affected people. So we start to think about what this injustice, we're not even going into why are these people in prison in the first place, but there's a whole lot more could be said on that. So there was a mother of a 7-month-old baby who, in fact, the baby was born in prison. They were together in prison until the baby was 3 months old and came out of prison. And people are on license when they come out of prison. They are subject to recall if they offend against the term of their license. Some of those recalls are for extremely minor breaches. In this case, the mother was recalled to prison, but her arrest to take her back to prison happened at midnight in the home of her parents where she was living with the baby. She was taken away from her baby a couple of days before the lockdown, which meant that she then was not able to see her baby at all. So this 7-month-old who had never been separated from his mother is suddenly without his mother for several months. There were children whose mum was coming home on release on temporary license, which means that someone's moving towards the end of their sentence. They often have a job outside of the prison, and this woman was going out of the prison every day to work and was allowed to spend 5 days a month on what's called child resettlement leave and on ordinary rottle back at home with her family, so that she and the children would get used to her being back to help with settling. She, in fact, got a phone call while she was on the train, because prisoners on rottle are allowed to have a phone for going out to work as well. And she got phoned by the governor of the prison saying, prison's going into lockdown, you need to come back. And she could have gone home to her family at that point and breached everything and done the wrong thing. She didn't. She stayed on the train. She went back to prison. She's been locked up for the next 8 months, hasn't seen any of her children in that time. And they have developed all kinds of trauma responses to what's happened. There's another 11-year-old I've heard about whose father was finding the lack of contact with them. They were able to have a quick phone call every day. But for many prisoners to even use the phone, that risks, it's a phone on a shared landing. There's maybe 32 prisoners using that phone. People are as worried about the virus in prison, or perhaps more worried than out of prison. So you've got to take your own public health risk to go and use the phone. Short call, because everybody wants to talk to their families. And this father was finding it too painful, the fact he didn't know when he would see his child again, so stopped contact, and that 11-year-old started to self-harm. I could go on and on and on with these stories. I'm analysing data on this topic at the moment, but I won't. But I did reach a slight point of despair over this in the summer when I realised that with a government who are happy to cage people for 23 hours and 45 minutes a day, they really have very little concern for their families and for what's going on in the bigger picture. Just a slight change of mood here, but we're approaching the anniversary of the Learning Together event at Fishmongers Hall, 29th of November last year, when Usman Khan murdered Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones. When that happened, I was at a Criminal Justice Awards ceremony not very far away, just across the river, and news filtered through of what had happened because it involved colleagues and friends from the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge. And it involved people who had spent time in prison or were still prisoners. Learning Together is something that operates, it's a learning environment with people who are in prison and out of prison. And at the awards ceremony I was at, we were a similarly mixed group of people. A lot of people who work in criminal justice have themselves spent time in prison or have been criminalised. And in the days that followed that tragic and awful event, and even now a year on, what happened that day and the behaviour and words of Jack's father, David Merritt, who, if you've not seen him, it's worth looking him up. He called on the government not to increase sentences as a knee-jerk response. And all that happened on that day has confounded people, because some of the heroes of that day were people who had been in prison or, in fact, were still serving prisoners out on day release. It included a man serving a sentence for murder. And I think what that showed me, and I sort of leave it with you to think about, is that justice is not binary. And I think the reason Fishmongers Hall and who was involved in it and who was killed and who did the killing and who did the saving and who all these individual people were, showed that we are not all one thing. The people that we punish, the people that injustices are committed against, are humans like all of us. And justice for me should not mean injustice for you. Justice is not straightforward, it is complex, it is nuanced, and I repeat, it is absolutely not binary. And what I really want to see happening, because I think we need to keep hope very much at the centre of things, because otherwise we just descend into a fog of gloom, but is we need disruptive thinking. And we need new imaginings of what justice looks like in this country. And I very much hope that in the discussion and in your own thinking, you will take those ideas forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Shona. That's massively inspiring from both of you. Jonathan is about to join us, but in the interim, I wondered if I could ask you both a question. I think one of the things that unites your work is the recognition that how we think about justice matters. It matters for people, it matters for lives, but also in different ways, a real sort of drive, I think, to communicate the implications of justice to a wider public. Shona, you sort of highlight almost the callous disregard that society, but particularly politicians who kind of should know better, have for the lives of prisoners and their families. Zofia, you highlight from a different perspective that actually there's a really strong argument that governments, in particular states, but also people, have obligations to contribute to the greater good, even in the presence of free riding or non-compliance by others. Those are issues that people grapple with in their day-to-day lives and don't find answers. So I suppose my sort of question in the interim for both of you is, how can we do a better job of articulating justice and social justice to a wider public? How can we include the public and indeed politicians who make the decisions about, in Zofia's work, responsibility sharing for refugees, or in Shona's work, to have a callous disregard for justice in prisons? How can we better engage that public?
I don't have an answer, though I'm hoping that Professor Wolff will tell us. But I do have a colleague, Alice Badarin, who's developed this really excellent idea of helping us think through the ways that we could be limited without even realizing it. And that's the idea of anticipatory injustice. And I was reminded of that when Shona, you were talking, that if you know you're going to face so many obstacles, then you may start internalizing it, developing adaptive preferences, if you like. And how do you combat this burden, knowing that you're anticipating the injustice that you're going to be facing, and you somehow try to not be affected too much by it? And just to flag up, this concept is helpful because it helps us identify the various ways in which we might be actively influenced.
I guess my answer to the question is it's really difficult, but it's absolutely crucial. Because if we're wanting to see political change and policy change, politicians are interested in votes. So I think that's why they're very often not interested in these issues, because the public are not engaged. And part of what I've been sort of wrestling with and trying to work through, and one of the projects that I'm making very slow progress on is trying to write something that would be a book for the general public that puts some of these stories out there. I mean, Secret Barrister has done a fantastic job. I definitely want to flag up her books on uncovering some of what's going on in the justice system at a very easy to read level, so that people start to become engaged in issues about justice in the same way as people care about the NHS, because everybody has experienced healthcare. We need people to understand what's going on in criminal and social justice before they are at the before they're facing the harsh realities of it, so that they do start to realise that this is something that influences all of our society and is impacting all of us, even though we don't realise. So that's not a great answer, but it's the one I've got for now.
Fantastic. Jonathan Wolff has joined us. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. We were just having a brief exchange about how we can engage the general public in questions of justice and social justice. And I've already sort of given a little bit of an introduction to you and your work, but I think that's a theme that I think characterizes a lot of what you do. So it's a nice segue into your work in the ways in which you connect theoretical questions of social justice to very applied public policy issues, which I think is a really defining characteristic of your work and your teaching. And I know you happen to have just come directly from teaching, so we're really grateful to have you. So I'll leave the floor to you for about 10 minutes or so to tell us a bit about how you think about these themes, and then we'll come back to a discussion.
That's great. Just check first of all, you can hear me okay? I'm assuming you can. Okay. So very nice to be here. Sorry that I missed the earlier sessions. What I think I'll talk about is the way I do political philosophy and public policy. I know this is a session about justice, but I don't use the concept of justice very much myself. I don't ignore it, but I'm in some ways much more interested in the concept of injustice rather than justice. And what I mean by this is that I'm very interested in problems and difficulties, areas in the world where people are experiencing problems, and thinking about the types of campaigns or activism or groups, for example, disability activists who are presenting cases in terms that are related to justice, and to think about how we as theorists can help people in those concerns, rather than thinking that we have a theory that will somehow solve all their problems. So in recent work, this is the type of work I've been trying to do, working on questions about poverty, questions of disability. And I've tried to avoid questions of methodology, in that, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, I went to a conference called Social Justice in Practice. I was very much looking forward to it, but when I came home, I realized that had it been called Social Justice in Theory, it would have been exactly the same conference, because what was happening was that people were just discussing the methodology of social justice, what justice meant, ideal and non-ideal theory, which I think Zofia has taken you through to some extent. So there's a lot of concern about conceptual distinction making, and this is partly because if you're a philosopher, that's what you were trained to do and what you're good at, and you're less good at looking at particular issues. But more recently, I've been persuaded by others to write about methodology, and I've done that. I seem to be talking about nothing else now. And what I have done in my own work is to, I think, codify approaches that other people have already taken. So I'm not claiming to be a path breaker in methodology, but maybe just to be a bit more reflective about what a lot of people are doing. And what I've done is contrasted what I call applied philosophy with what I call engaged philosophy. Neither of these are great terms, but let me try to explain. So what I mean by applied philosophy is the idea that people start off with a philosophical theory, perhaps utilitarianism, perhaps Kantian ethics, perhaps Rawls's theory of justice, and they think that armed with that theory, they can pretty much solve any problem that you throw at them. So the paradigm example of this is the philosopher, Oxford philosopher R.M. Hare, who was a utilitarian. And he was a subtle thinker, clever, very clever man, but he was sure that utilitarianism was right and that he had proved it to be true in another book. And he wrote, I think, about 4 volumes of applied ethics, applied political philosophy, where he just used utilitarianism to show how to solve every problem. And you pretty much know how it's going to go. And there's probably a bit of choice about how exactly the arguments go, but you know, this is how he's going to solve things. So he starts with his framework, and from his framework, he deduces answers given the different problems. So he knows the answer before you give him the question, roughly speaking. So I find this a very unhelpful approach, and as you can tell, I've caricatured it. Hare would be appalled if he was still alive to hear his approach described this way. But instead, what I recommend is what I call engaged philosophy, where you start from the problem. What is worrying people? Why are people concerned about this issue right now? And it's a sort of discussion anyone might have in a pub or in newspaper columns or dinner party, just people talking about values and how values collide and conflict. And then our job as philosophers, first of all, is to try to understand this clash of values and maybe articulate it better than it's being done, see what follows from what distinctions to make, how we can identify and isolate that problem. And then what I like to do myself is to think about the history of the problem. How did we get there? What were things like before we got here? Because one of the problems we often see in life is policy cycles where people propose a solution and try it out, only to find out that actually that was the problem 20 years ago that the current situation was a solution to, if you see what I mean. So you get problem, solution, except that's the problem. So you come up with a new solution, but the solution is the old problem. So that happens quite a lot, particularly in the development world, actually, but elsewhere as well. So I like to look at the history. I like to look at international comparisons, because quite often if we've got a problem, other countries have got it. What have they done? To look at our current regulations, how we got it, and then think about, you know, what is our menu for policy change? What are our policy options? What else could we be doing? And from that, we can then start thinking about what philosophical resources have we got to argue for the ethics or justice, or at least overcoming injustice of one option rather than another. And this is subtle. It requires economic analysis, political analysis, behavioral analysis. I'm always on the lookout for unintended consequences. And quite often the unintended consequences give you the exact opposite of what you want. We can talk about my work on risk and risk analysis if we want to do that a bit further on. So so in my work, I come to the philosophy early in terms of dissecting the debate, and later on as a way of helping to evaluate policy options. And quite often all we can do is make a fairly modest recommendation to make small changes, with the idea of proposing changes that make some people better off in significant ways and no one worse off in significant ways. And that is quite a trick, but it can be done sometimes. Quite often you can make a big difference just by being considerate and thinking a different way. We see this in disability, as I mentioned, one area I've looked at. Poverty is much more expensive, much more difficult to deal with. So this is the approach I take, that contrast between applied philosophy, where you start with a theory and know what your solution is going to be before you even get started, and the engaged approach, where you look at the problem and you don't yet even know what values are engaged until you start talking, and you pull on any resource, philosophical or non-philosophical, that might help you resolve the injustice that you see in front of you, or at least relieve it, if not resolve it. And perhaps on that note, I will stop, and I'll be very happy to take questions, obviously. So I'm seeing you, Alex. I'm not hearing anything at this point.
Fantastic. Susan, do you want to come in with the first question?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Three fabulously interesting talks, and I learned so much, because it's not my area, but obviously something that as a member of society we should all be interested in. And Shona, that led, you know, your present. I mean, at one point I had tears thinking about those mothers, and it got me thinking. You know, there are lots of, well, not lots actually, there's a few books that you can buy about race to read to little ones. My little one's 3.5, and I was really taken with your concept, the concept that, you know, justice isn't binary, and what's right for me is wrong for someone else. And I have to admit, teaching my 3.5-year-olds that concept of, you know, what's right and what's wrong, and what's right for him and wrong for me, and your idea of a book for the general public is, I think, captivating, because we actually need to almost learn how to behave in society given what's happening. You know, I in my work, I was chatting with some young people at a further education college a few years ago, and they couldn't understand why the bankers who had caused the recession, there was no justice. You know, why young people starting out on an apprenticeship couldn't get one because there were no jobs because of the crash and everything. And I, you know, I think it's more a plea than a question would be to write a book for toddlers and teenagers, because I think we need to start at all levels to understand, you know, why there is justice in some areas and not in others. So more a comment and a plea than a question, but please come back at me and tell me.
Well, I think that's a really interesting thought and a really interesting idea. And certainly my experience has been, since I started this work, and I came to it in 2011-ish, as a question. I suddenly thought, why? Because I'd been a criminal lawyer and also a family lawyer, and I was suddenly looking at trying to find research on what was happening to children when mums went to prison, and I couldn't find any. I was doing a master's, had to write an essay on the gendered nature of imprisonment. And I was trying to find information about what happened to their children. I couldn't find any. And I thought they must be going into care, or maybe they're not. And as a family lawyer, I understood what the care system was like. And then I put it together with the fact that judges are supposed to consider impact on dependents whenever they sentence. And I thought, but how can they if they don't know what it is, because nobody's done any research on it? And that was how I ended up doing a DPhil at Oxford. I didn't mean to ever be an academic. But what has been really interesting is that when I have talked to anybody, whether it is a judge or someone in the Ministry of Justice, or a colleague, or a teenager, because I have teenage children, talking to their friends, people are really shocked at what's happening, and they go, this can't be all right. Why did we not know about this? Why are we not doing it differently? And so I think there is a huge education element in all of this, that we have so many blind spots. Each of us only understands our own experience. And somehow what we need to do is extend the information that we share and the way that we share it, so that it's not bashing people over the head, and it's not saying you must do it, and it's not necessarily campaigning, but it is just sharing information about the world. That I think the Black Lives Matter has shown us that so many of us who thought maybe we understood a bit about race knew nothing, and we needed to educate ourselves. And so I think, yes, you're absolutely right. Whether I'll write the book or not is another thing, but I think
Zofia, did you want to come in on this?
Well, I just wanted to come in with a slightly more pessimistic take. I mean, I think you're right. I think a lot of it is blind spots. I do worry in my more pessimistic days that a lot of it is just not wanting to pay attention to these problems. And I think people don't know some things because they don't want to. the requirement, for example, that in order to bring in a foreign spouse, a British citizen needs to qualify by earning a certain amount, that has a disproportionate impact on everyone in a predictable way by income, but also by gender, given the distribution of work between genders. I think that was really widely publicized, and yet somehow doesn't catch fire, right? So that question, Alexander, that you had, how do you communicate it? What is the X factor? What will make people see that there is something important there, that they will want to fight for it? Since a lot of things just fall flat. And Joe, I told everyone you'll be able to tell us. So.
So yes, yeah. Well, so what I feel that so John Stuart Mill on Liberty, I think it was, has this passage about how the world is moving in the direction of equality, and that so he's trying to argue against people who are very pessimistic, and so when I think about the things in my lifetime, I remember equal pay for equal women being debated as a question. So I was at my uncle and aunt's home in the summer. I'd stay for a week or two. I remember my uncle sitting at the breakfast table, reading the Daily Telegraph, shaking his head and saying how terrible it was that women wanted equal pay, because that would encourage them to go to work and it would take money away from their husbands who needed it, and women were only working for pin money. So when was that? That was about 1972, and that was not a minority view. So I do think that we go in cycles. There are times when we seem to be making progress, and other times when we seem to be going backwards. I still have the optimism that if you draw the line through the cycles, we're going in the direction of justice. Things like the speed in which gay marriage took off astonished me. Civil partnership came in. I thought, okay, that's a tremendous victory, but we have to be happy with that. What was it, 4 or 5 years later, there's full gay marriage in the UK and the US. So there is progress. We just tend not to notice it very much, or we forget where things were before. So I think I said in one book, I'm cautiously optimistic about some things, and I remain in that way. But I don't know if that was the answer to this question or a different question, because I didn't obviously have the context to it.
It was certainly an answer to a very important question. And I think it also gives us a sense of actually why education in this area is so important at different levels, because it gives us a flavor of needing to historicize justice, and that actually to feel empowered. Zofia mentioned the concept of anticipatory injustice. And I think the way I interpreted that, you need a sense of your position in the world, probably historically as well as contemporary, in order to make sense of the obligations you have vis-a-vis other people who are complying or not. So I think certainly there's coherence across this. I wanted to build on this theme by asking you a little bit about your own scholarship and your own work, and particularly related to interdisciplinarity. So in all of your work, you're engaged with both the normative and the empirical in different ways. So Zofia and Jonathan, you're engaged in the normative in the sense of the ethical. Shona, you're engaged in the normative in the sense that law and ethics go hand in hand. But you're also engaged in the empirical world. So Jonathan, you talked about, for instance, your recent work on risk and how you work with economists and behavioralists and political scientists. Zofia, you drew on concepts that are core to kind of explanatory international relations to make sense of compliance, non-compliance, responsibility sharing. In a non-ideal world, you're invoking the empirical world. Shona, you said that what brought you back from the bar to academia wasn't a sort of desire to just stay rooted in the law, but to reach out to a socio-legal world and engage and understand the social justice context of the law. So my question to each of you is, how do you think about interdisciplinarity and its importance in your work? And when you work on justice, how important do you think it is that other social scientists, for instance, graduate students who are listening, don't leave colleagues in philosophy, in political theory, or in law in isolation, but reach out and say, we need to make your expertise part of an interdisciplinary conversation. And anyone who wants to go first with that is very welcome.
So I'm happy to go first. Last should be first, or whatever. So for me, there's no magic in interdisciplinarity. I think, having been an administrator and being told to encourage interdisciplinarity and seeing the initiatives people do. So I've been to events where people have said, interpretation, everyone needs to know about interpretation. Let's have a seminar about interpretation and bring people from different areas. And what happens is you get sort of turf wars about who's got the right concept of interpretation, and people go away hating each other and not profiting. So for me, interdisciplinarity always starts with a research question or a problem. So you need to start with something, and in advance you don't know whether you need an interdisciplinary team or not. It depends on the nature of the problem. So sometimes things are very discipline based, but it turns out that the things I've been doing lately, so without having intended to, I got involved in a lot of work around ethics of COVID and vaccines. So I've been on a number of committees. So I'm talking to virologists, I'm talking to people in disciplines I'd never heard of before. I'm listening to presentations I have no understanding of at all quite often, but I assume someone else in the room does. But that's because we're looking at questions like how can the world ensure a fair distribution of vaccine when it becomes available? So you need a whole range. You can have lawyers answering that question, you can have philosophers, but unless you have people who actually know about the properties of a vaccine in the room, you're not going to be making any wise decisions, or unless you have people who can read the data about the death profile. You can't even start thinking about priority, because you need that mix of theory and empirics. But what I learned early on, and so one area where I've been involved in quite a lot, is on the regulation of recreational drugs. I think I've been on committees about 3 times. They all make the same recommendations, are always ignored, but they're always, I always learn from them. And what I found, so some of the early committees I was on, there were journalists as well as academics on the committee. And it was amazing to see how journalists work. So I'm a philosopher, philosophers work in, we don't even share offices, we don't write papers together very often. So we're very solitary. And if I wanted to, in my normal work, if I wanted to know about an area, the first thing I do would be to Google it. Then I'd find a few papers and I'd read those papers, and I think I've done my research. So that, but having been on these committees and seeing journalists, what they do, they don't Google, well, they Google for a name to phone up. So they find the expert and they will make the phone call, and in half an hour, they will have a bibliography which is more up to date than I got. They will understand what the current controversies are. I would have just cherry picked. So imagine someone coming into your field and choosing the 3 best papers and thinking that's the state of the knowledge, when everything is contested, everything changes. So a paper 5 years out of date is no good in some themes. In philosophy, it's still current. So you need to understand the disciplinary norms, and you do that by talking to people. So that is my, that's my advice. Put Google down and find someone to talk to, and just pick their brains. And most people, as you know, most academics are just delighted to talk about their speciality for an hour, and you can just get so much more out of that. Even better to work with them, of course, but not every project requires that. So I would say, don't force interdisciplinarity, but when you do it properly, do it with people, not just reading the work in a discipline where you don't understand the disciplinary norms. Okay.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts, Zofia or Shona? Shona.
Can I come in just quickly on that? Just something I did when I was a DPhil student, which might be of interest to any students listening, is, I don't know if it's still running, but along with Aoife Higgins, who's now Director of Research at the Care Matters Institute and was in Oxford till this summer, we set up a child and young persons sort of study group amongst PhD students across the university. And that was really interesting because we had anyone who was doing anything linked to children or young people from any discipline. So we had people in health, she was in education, I was in criminology, somebody who was doing Japanese. I mean, we had all sorts of things. And that really extended our thinking enormously. It was really interesting. Whether it made much difference to our work, but I think it got us thinking outside of our boxes, which was really great. And I've been a bit of a solitary researcher for the last however many years, and I just am desperate always now for collaboration with other people. And recently, because justice is all about social justice too, you know, it impacts on health, it impacts psychology, it impacts on child services. There's sort of no end to the interdisciplinarity of what I'm doing at the moment.
Zofia.
No, just to say, I actually love co-writing. So I think there are all sorts of rewards of doing that. I also agree it should be driven by the question, but I do think I want to acknowledge, I mean, I started off wanting to just do political science and I then switched focus. But I think I want to acknowledge sort of two forces that push us against interdisciplinarity, even though really some of the best questions absolutely require it. One is just the sort of time constraint and the rewards of the discipline. And the other one is that sometimes it's very difficult to go deeply because you have to go wide as well. And so, you know, it is hard to do it well, but yeah, good luck to everyone.
We don't have any questions from the audience. Are attendees too shy to ask our panel a question? I find that hard to believe in Oxford. No? I mean, we're nearly up for time. I wonder if the panel, so one of the things that struck me about Helena Kennedy's talk was the end bit where she said, rock the boat. And I think it's really important. We need to get out and question and just not take things as the status quo, as you've all said as well. I just wonder if you could each give us a brief example of how you've rocked the boat and words of encouragement for the audience. I mean, Joe, I follow you on Twitter. You rock the boat quite frequently, yeah, in a very amusing way.
So yeah, it is true, and I can remember I did tweet once. So before I went into academia, I worked for 3 years in the legal office of an insurance company, and one of my bosses said to me when I arrived, you know, the main thing to remember here is don't make waves. I thought, hang on, that's my specialist subject, making waves. I'm obviously in the wrong place. And I write a column in The Guardian, and roughly speaking, there are two types. One says, as academics, we have a horrible job. And the other type says, as academics, we have a lovely job. And when I say, as academics, we have a terrible job, in the comments I get, yes, absolutely, you should see how bad it is here. But when I write, as academics, we're privileged because we have so much autonomy, good salaries, we're doing what we love. People write, you're in cloud cuckoo land, it's not like that around here. So I get criticized for saying what I think is true, that we are the most privileged people on earth. And that maybe that's not what you meant by rocking the boat, but I don't know. I am deliberately provocative at times, but in terms of academic work, well, I think again, this isn't what you wanted, but when I did my first policy report, it was a government report. It's probably the grandest thing I've ever done. It was a review of gambling law. I was a junior academic, and by accident I got on this committee. That my head of department was invited and didn't want to do it, so he recommended me. I was completely unknown. I would never have been asked to do it. And I spent 2 years of my life, I barely did any other research other than into gambling, law of gambling and regulation of gambling. When the report came out, I didn't think to put it on my CV, because in those days, that type of work, so this is the year 2000 roughly, that because it wasn't academic work in peer-reviewed journals or prestigious presses, it just didn't really count. So I suppose what I would say, I rocked the boat by doing things because I wanted to do that are now highly validated as forms of impact and engagement. So I think, you know, I wasn't doing it as a revolutionary. I just did it because I thought it was important and valuable, and probably more valuable than other ways of spending my time. I would say that's my modest form of rocking the boat. And also, I suppose I would try to take credit. Zofia will know whether I actually did this, but I ran a series of seminars called Priority and Practice. I still do a bit, which were interdisciplinary. And because they're interdisciplinary, I wanted to make sure that people try to learn from each other rather than compete with each other. So I think I rocked the boat by introducing a little bit of civility into philosophy conferences, because beforehand, you know, the norm was that people would try to rip everyone else's head off, draw blood with the sharpness of their criticism. Whereas I said, if you want to do that over tea. But in the conference itself, let's try to be constructive and help people make their papers better rather than make them cry. So I think you know, that was a change. Again, not what you were looking for.
No, that I think will be very helpful to our audience. Zofia, Shona?
So just to actually begin by praising the series, saying something that wasn't mentioned, I think another way in which it was wonderful was that it gave loads of opportunities to graduate students and early career researchers, and I benefited from that. Which brings me to an important point. I mean, by far, the only influence I'll have, and it's going to be limited, is through teaching. And it should be limited, but it's a wonderful part of this. Finding time for it is always a challenge, but whenever you're doing it, you're loving it. And you're thinking, actually, that's the thing that matters. That's where you need to assign the best papers. And then from the comfort of my permanent job, I can say that the one semi-brave decision one can make is to genuinely try to research things that you think you have something to say or that you're interested in, because there are so many pressures in academia to not do that.
Yeah.
Shona? I think mostly I do just rock boats, and I came into academia, like I say, not meaning to be an academic, and I thought that everybody did activist research, and then discovered that that wasn't really what most people were doing. So it, you know, rocked the boat even initially when somebody quite senior said to me, what you're doing, this should be an NGO report, which I disagreed with. That was my DPhil. But they didn't like sort of the way I was looking at the subject. And from then it's just got more so. So when I was trying the stuff that I won the Impact Award for, which was making films for the judiciary and probation and everybody else, it took me 7 months to get a judge to listen to me and to look at the research evidence to see that they actually needed to understand this stuff. And people have said I'm like a dog with a bone and all sorts of other less complimentary things about it. And I did reach a point this summer where I thought, I'm not sure I can do this anymore, because I was getting criticism from academics because I was being quite out there with sort of saying, I think we need some change here. And I was getting criticism from NGOs who got funded by the government, who didn't like me holding up a child rights framework and saying, how are things measuring up against this at the moment? So it's been it's an interesting space to be. But I'm not sure I could do it differently. So I think that if people, you know, if that's the way you're wired, if that's the kind of work you want to do, if the things that you're doing do connect across society, you can't always get anywhere without making a bit of a noise, and not everybody likes that noise. It's just how it is.
Thank you so much, Zofia, Shona, Joe, for giving up your time, being so generous with your ideas and your thoughts. I think this has been a really dynamic, inspiring conversation on justice from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, looking at different areas of society. And I think one of the remarkable things is not just how interesting the content you've shared with has been, but how fascinating it's been to get to know you as individuals. And each of you had shared things about what motivates you in your work, about aspects of your career. And I think you've been really open and honest, which for me and probably many people listening will really inspire them to think about how their work and their role in society can engage with these questions of justice. So a big thank you on behalf of all of us.
Yeah, a very big thank you.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. And sorry, I missed the first half, which I would have loved to have heard.
Huge thank you to our participants. We look forward to seeing you all next week for our last lecture. I think it's going to be fantastic. Alex, do you want to tell us a little bit more about?
Next week, we move from justice to protection, and we've got Dr. Hugo Slim, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government, and also very recently Deputy Head of the International Committee on the Red Cross. So again, bringing together the world of policy and practice with academic insight. So join us next week for protection. Bye, everyone.